The knock came at the back door just after midnight. 3 sharp raps that cut through the howling Kansas wind like a blade through silk. And when Effie Crawford swung it open with her late husband's rifle aimed at chest height, the last thing she expected to find was a drifter standing in the freezing dark holding 2 crates of supplies like he had been invited to supper. She almost pulled the trigger. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a woman's bones when she has been surviving on nothing but pride and stubbornness for 4 months straight. Her children were asleep upstairs. The larder had been empty since Tuesday. The bank had sent its 3rd notice, and outside, the November wind of 1882 was trying very hard to peel the Crawford homestead right off its foundation. The man did not flinch at the rifle. He looked at it calmly, then looked at her, and in the thin yellow light spilling from the kitchen lantern she could see dark eyes beneath the brim of a battered hat, a jaw shadowed with several days of stubble, and the kind of stillness that belongs only to men who have learned not to make sudden movements in dangerous situations. "Mrs. Crawford," he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who rationed his words the way a sensible person rations water in dry country. "My name is Clark Brenner. I've got flour, salt pork, coffee, lamp oil, and some canned goods. Somebody needed to think ahead." She stared at him. The wind screamed around the corner of the house and knocked a loose shutter against the siding. "You have about 30 seconds, she said, "to explain how you know my name and why I shouldn't shoot you where you stand." He shifted the weight of the crates slightly, unhurried. "Because if you shoot me, these crates drop and then you're still out of supplies. And because I knew your husband." Those 4 words hit her like a physical blow. Her finger moved fractionally on the trigger. "James is dead." "Yes, ma'am, I know. I was there when it happened." That was how it started. That was the moment from which everything else unspooled, like thread from a spool knocked off a shelf, rolling across the floor in every direction at once, finding every corner of every room, tangling itself around the legs of furniture and the ankles of everyone in the house. But to understand why Clark Brenner was standing in the frozen dark with crates of supplies and a dead man's name on his lips, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the September morning when James Crawford rode out of Effie's life forever, and the slow, grinding months that followed. James Crawford had been a good man in the way that most good men are in the Kansas Territory in 1882, which is to say he worked hard, drank moderately, loved his family fiercely, and made exactly one catastrophic mistake that cost him everything. He had borrowed money from the wrong man. The wrong man's name was Harlan Voss, and Voss operated out of Dodge City with the kind of respectable surface that small frontier towns mistake for character. He was a land speculator, a money lender, and a man who collected debts with the same cold efficiency that other men collect postage stamps. James had borrowed $400 to expand the homestead's cattle operation, convinced that the prices would hold through winter. They did not hold. A disease swept through the herd in August, and by September, James Crawford owed a debt he could not pay. He had ridden to Dodge City to negotiate a payment plan. He never came back. The official story, delivered by Voss's lawyer 2 weeks later, was that James Crawford had been robbed and killed on the road between Dodge City and the Crawford homestead, some 30 miles northeast of town. A terrible tragedy. Voss expressed his condolences and then, in the same breath, mentioned that the debt was still owed and that the property would need to be assessed if payments could not be arranged. Effie had stood in her doorway, holding her youngest daughter on her hip, watching the lawyer's horse kick up dust as he rode away, and felt something harden inside her chest like iron cooling in a mold. She was 27 years old. She had 2 children, an 8-year-old son named Thomas and a 5-year-old daughter named Ruth. She had 112 acres of Kansas farmland, a house that needed a new roof, a team of horses, 12 remaining cattle, and a debt of $400 to a man she had never met but had already learned to hate. What she did not have was help. Her nearest neighbor was the Whitfield family, 3 miles east, And while Agnes Whitfield had been kind enough to bring food in the immediate aftermath of James's death, Effie understood that charity had limits and that her pride had very few. Her parents were back in Ohio. James's family was scattered across Missouri. The town of Crestfield, which was what passed for civilization in her corner of Kansas, was 8 miles to the south and offered little beyond a general store, a post office, a saloon, a church, and the usual assortment of men who looked at a recently widowed woman with either pity or calculation. She managed. The word is simple and the reality was anything but. She got up before dawn every single morning and worked until her hands bled and her back screamed and her eyes could barely focus, and then she got up and did it again. She sent Thomas to the Whitfield place for lessons 3 days a week, because whatever else happened, her children would be educated. She rationed the food with military precision. She sold 2 cattle in October for enough to buy winter supplies, or what she thought would be enough. And then the early hard freeze came in late October and destroyed what remained of the kitchen garden, and the calculation that she had made so carefully turned out to be wrong. By the first week of November, Effie Crawford was in the particular kind of quiet desperation that doesn't announce itself loudly, but sits in the stomach like a stone, and colors every hour of every day a specific shade of gray that has no name. She had started to think about what she would do if she truly could not hold on, whether she could find work in Crestfield, whether her mother would take the children, whether there was any version of this story that didn't end with her losing the land that she and James had broken themselves to build. She had not found an answer. And then, 11 days into November, Clark Brenner knocked on her back door. She did not shoot him. She lowered the rifle 3 inches, which was not the same as lowering it entirely, and said, "Talk, and it had better be the truth because I have very little patience left for anything else." He talked. He set the crates down on the back step, slowly and carefully, making no fast movements, and he talked. He told her that he had ridden with James Crawford for 6 weeks the previous year, not as an outlaw or anything disreputable, but as a cattle drover on a long haul from Texas that James had taken work on to try to build up some savings. They had shared a campfire for 42 nights, and in that time, Clark said, James had talked about his family constantly, about Effie and Thomas and little Ruth and the homestead and what he was building. He was a good man, Clark said. "I know he was," Effie said, and the flatness in her voice was not coldness but the opposite of it, the particular flatness of emotion that has been compressed so hard it has nowhere left to go. "How do you know what happened to him?" Clark was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the bare cottonwood trees at the edge of the yard, a sound like whispering. "I've been working out of Dodge City," he said. "Not for Voss, before you ask. I was helping at the livery. I hear things. A man hears things in a livery. People talk around horses like the horses can't repeat it." "What did you hear?" "I heard that James Crawford's death wasn't a robbery. I heard that Voss had a man waiting on that road. I heard the debt was just the excuse." The cold that went through Effie then had nothing to do with the November wind. "Why?" she said. "Why would Voss want James dead?" "Because of the land," Clark said. "Your land. There's water on it, a good spring underground. Voss has been buying up land with water rights all through this county. Your husband's debt was arranged, Mrs. Crawford. It was bait." She stood very still for a long time. The lantern light flickered. Inside the house, she could hear the distant, peaceful sound of her children sleeping, completely unaware that their father's death had been a calculated act and that the man now standing on their back step knew it. "Come inside," she said finally. She stepped back. "Bring the supplies." Clark Brenner picked up the crates and carried them into the Crawford kitchen, and Effie locked the back door behind him and set her rifle against the wall within reach, and looked at the stranger standing in her house with the particular combination of fear and anger, and something she could not quite name that would, over the next several weeks, rearrange everything she thought she knew about herself. He was taller than she had first registered, broad through the shoulders, with the lean, weathered look of a man who spent most of his life outdoors. He was perhaps 30, 31, maybe 32, it was hard to say. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that might have been from squinting into the sun and might have been from something harder. He moved with the economy of a man who had learned that unnecessary movement was a form of waste. He put the crates on the kitchen table and took off his hat and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and waited. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She put the kettle on, because in any crisis, the act of making coffee provided a structure around which a person could organize their thoughts. She unpacked the first crate while the kettle heated, finding 20 pounds of flour, a slab of salt pork wrapped in cloth, 2 cans of molasses, a tin of baking powder, 4 cans of beans, a pound of coffee beans, and 2 bottles of lamp oil. The second crate held more: dried apples, a block of hard cheese wrapped in wax, cornmeal, salt, and a folded piece of oilskin. It was not extravagance. It was exactly what a person needed to survive a Kansas winter, selected with the kind of pragmatic precision that spoke of someone who had thought about it carefully. "This must have cost you significantly," she said, not turning around. "It's not a loan," he said. "I'm not Voss." "I didn't think you were." She turned then. "I'm asking because I need to understand what you want." He met her gaze and held it. "Nothing," he said. "James talked about you every night around the fire for 6 weeks. He talked about how his wife could outwork any man he knew, and how she had more courage than most people he'd ever met, and how she deserved a better life than the frontier gave her. When I heard what happened to him, and I found out that you were here alone with 2 children and a debt that was manufactured to steal your land, I came." "You came," she said. "I came." The kettle began to whistle. She made the coffee. She set a cup in front of him and took one herself and sat down across the table from him and looked at him over the rim of her cup with a measuring kind of attention, the way a person looks at something they cannot quite categorize and have not yet decided what to make of. "You said you hear things," she said. "What else do you know about Voss?" And Clark Brenner set his cup down and told her everything. What he knew was considerable. Harlan Voss was 45, a former Kansas City banker who had moved his operations westward after some professional difficulties that he had managed to smooth over with money and the right connections. He had been operating in this corner of Kansas for 3 years, building a web of debt arrangements, land purchases, and intimidation that had already swallowed 7 homesteads. He employed 2 men full-time, a lawyer named Pritchard who handled the legal mechanisms of his schemes, and a man named Roy Deaver who handled the other kind of mechanism. Deaver, Clark told her quietly, was the man who had been waiting on the road. Effie listened to all of this without speaking. She held her coffee cup in both hands and listened, and the hardness in her chest that had been forming since September cooled and set into something specific and purposeful. "If I go to the sheriff," she said. "Sheriff Alderman has borrowed money from Voss," Clark said. "The circuit judge. I don't know about the judge, but getting to him would take time and money, and Voss would know about any legal action before it was filed. His lawyer is in every courthouse in this county. So what do you suggest?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. They were large hands, scarred across the knuckles, the hands of a man who had done hard physical work for many years. "I suggest you don't try to fight Voss directly. Not yet. I suggest you focus on holding onto the land through the winter, building your resources, and finding proof of what he did to James. Proof that could go to someone outside this county. And what do you get out of helping me do that?" He looked up. "I told you, nothing." "Nobody does nothing for nothing," she said. "That's frontier mathematics. It doesn't change." "Maybe I feel responsible," he said. "Maybe I spent 6 weeks hearing a good man talk about his family and then watched his death get arranged and didn't know it in time to stop it. Maybe doing something now is the only way I can live with that." Silence stretched between them, filled by the sound of wind and the soft ticking of the wood stove. "You can sleep in the barn," Effie said finally. "There's a pallet and blankets. In the morning you can tell me what else you think needs to be done." "That's more than I expected," he said. "It's less than you brought," she said, nodding at the crates. "In the morning, Mr. Brenner." She showed him to the barn with a lantern, keeping 2 feet of careful distance between them at all times, and left him there, and walked back to the house through the cold dark, and stood in her kitchen for a long time before going to bed. She lay awake until nearly 3 in the morning, listening to the house settle, and thinking about the fact that a stranger had shown up at her door with supplies and information, and a dead man's trust. She thought about secrets and dark pasts and hidden motives, and she thought about what James had said to this man around campfires that would lead him to ride 30 miles in a Kansas November night. She did not sleep well, but she slept. In the morning, Thomas came downstairs first, as he always did, and found a stranger sitting at the kitchen table being methodically questioned by his mother, who was making cornmeal porridge and listening to everything the stranger said with the focused attention of someone cataloging information for later use. Thomas stopped in the doorway and looked at Clark Brenner with the frank, unafraid assessment of an 8-year-old who has recently lost his father and learned not to take anything for granted. "Who are you?" Thomas said. "My name is Clark Brenner. Your father was a friend of mine." Thomas considered this. He had a friend named Clark. He mentioned it once. Clark looked surprised, and then something in his face shifted, and Effie, watching from the stove, saw it. A flash of something raw and real that was there and gone so fast she might have imagined it, except that she was the kind of woman who noticed things. "He mentioned me," Clark said. "He said his friend Clark could identify any horse by its gait from 200 yards, Thomas said. "Can you really?" "Mostly," Clark said. "Come sit down and eat your breakfast." Thomas sat down as if this had all been arranged, and Ruth came down 10 minutes later and regarded Clark with wide, serious eyes for approximately 30 seconds before deciding he was acceptable and asking him if he could fix the broken spoke on the chicken coop gate, which had been broken since October. By the time breakfast was finished, Clark Brenner had been assessed and provisionally approved by both Crawford children, and Effie was not sure how she felt about that, except that she noted it the same way she noted everything, carefully and without immediate judgment. After breakfast, Clark fixed the chicken coop gate. He also shored up a section of fence along the north pasture that had been listing dangerously. He checked the horses and told Effie that the older mare had a soft shoe that needed attention before it became a real problem. He said all of this quietly and without any sense of performing helpfulness, in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything, as if the obvious thing was simply to see what needed doing and do it. Effie watched him work and told herself she was doing so because it was prudent to keep an eye on a stranger on her property. That was the first day. Over the next 2 weeks, Clark Brenner settled into the Crawford homestead with the same quiet efficiency with which he had arrived. He slept in the barn. He ate his meals at the kitchen table. He worked from first light to last light every day, doing all the things that had been piling up since James died: the fence repairs, the roof patch, the fire break clearing, the work of maintaining a working homestead through the onset of winter. He did not talk much, but when he did talk, it was worth listening to. Effie discovered this gradually, the way you discover any important truth, through accumulation rather than revelation. He would say something at supper that she would think about for the rest of the evening. He would answer one of Thomas's questions with a directness and a respect that struck her as unusual in a man addressing a child. He would look at her sometimes across the kitchen table with those dark, steady eyes and not say anything at all, and the silence would be the kind that has weight and substance. She caught herself thinking about him at odd moments, while she was doing the washing, while she was helping Ruth with her letters, while she lay in bed at night listening to the wind. This alarmed her. It alarmed her not because she thought him dangerous, though she had not entirely ruled that out, but because she had been a widow for 4 months, and the homestead was under threat from a powerful man with violent methods, and this was not the time to be thinking about a man's dark eyes across a kitchen table. She told herself this firmly and with conviction. It helped approximately not at all. On the 14th day of his stay, Effie was in the barn tending to the lame mare when Clark came in from the north pasture and found her there, and they ended up working together in the close, warm dark of the barn. And somewhere in the middle of an entirely practical conversation about the mare's hoof, he said something that made her laugh. A real laugh, the full-body kind that she had not produced in 4 months and had half believed she was no longer capable of. She stopped laughing and looked at him, surprised by herself. He was looking at her with an expression that he quickly rearranged into neutral, but not quickly enough. "I'm sorry," she said, not sure what she was apologizing for. "Don't be," he said. "It's a good sound." She went back into the house after that and stood in the kitchen and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and thought very clearly that she was in serious trouble of a kind that had nothing to do with Harlan Voss. The letter arrived on the 16th day. It came from Voss's lawyer, Pritchard, and it was politely worded and absolutely clear in its meaning. The debt, $400 plus accumulated interest, bringing the total to $530, was due in full by the 1st of January, 1883. If payment was not received by that date, legal proceedings would commence to seize the property in satisfaction of the debt. 7 weeks. Effie read the letter 3 times, standing at the kitchen table, and then set it down and looked at Clark, who had come inside for the noon meal. He read it. He put it down. He looked at her. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "We have 7 weeks. I need to make a trip to Dodge City." "What for?" "I know where Voss keeps his records, business records. If what I suspect is true, there's documentation of his arrangements that would interest a federal marshal. The kind of money-lending operation he runs, the fraud, the coerced debts, that's federal territory if it crosses county lines, which it does. You're going to steal his records," she said. "I'm going to borrow them long enough to copy what matters and return them before anyone knows they were touched." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's dangerous." "Yes. Deaver," she said. "The man who killed James. I know about Deaver. If he knows you're connected to me, he doesn't. I was just a livery worker as far as anyone in Dodge City is concerned." She thought about this. She thought about secrets and betrayal and the cold calculation of a man like Voss, and she thought about what it would cost Clark Brenner if something went wrong in Dodge City. "I don't want you taking risks for my sake," she said. The look he gave her then was not quite exasperation and not quite tenderness. It occupied some space between the two, like a door standing open between 2 rooms. "Your sake is one part of it. But if Voss did what I believe he did to James, then that needs answering regardless of what it costs me." She held his gaze. "When will you go?" "Tomorrow morning. I should be back within 4 days. And if you're not back in 4 days, give it a week before you worry." "I'll start worrying the moment you ride out," she said, and then looked slightly startled by her own honesty. He did not look startled. He looked at her steadily, with that quiet, particular attention that she had come to understand was simply how he engaged with things that mattered to him. "I'll be back," he said. He rode out before dawn the next morning. She stood on the back step in the cold and watched his horse disappear into the gray Kansas dark, and then went inside and made breakfast for her children, and told herself firmly that she was not counting the hours. She was absolutely counting the hours. He was gone for 5 days. They were the longest 5 days she had experienced since the weeks immediately following James's death, and she was not fully comfortable with what that comparison implied about the state of her feelings. She kept herself busy. She always kept herself busy. It was her primary coping mechanism, and she was aware of this, but she was especially thorough about it in those 5 days. She rendered the lard she had been putting off. She mended every piece of clothing in the house that needed mending. She taught Ruth 3 new letters and helped Thomas work through a particularly difficult set of arithmetic problems. She repaired the parlor curtain that had been hanging wrong since August. On the 4th day, the Whitfield boy came by with a message from Agnes saying that there was talk in Crestfield about the Crawford place, and that people were saying Voss's lawyer had been asking around about the property, trying to establish whether anyone would be interested in purchasing it after the 1st of January. Effie sent the Whitfield boy back with a polite message thanking Agnes for the information and saying that she had no intention of losing her land. On the 5th day, just before supper time, she heard a horse in the yard. She was at the stove when Clark came through the back door, and she turned and looked at him, and the relief that went through her was so immediate and so undisguised that she had to look away and pretend she was checking something on the stove. "You're a day late," she said. "There were complications," he said. He sounded tired. He looked tired. There was a bruise along his left cheekbone that had not been there when he left. She turned back around. "What happened to your face?" "A disagreement with someone who turned out not to be as asleep as he appeared to be," he said. "I'm fine. The other person is significantly more fine, because I didn't hit him back, which was the correct decision given where I was and what I was doing." She crossed the kitchen and put her hand on his jaw before she had consciously decided to do so, tilting his face toward the window light to look at the bruise. It was a 4-day-old bruise, yellowish at the edges, swollen at the center, and it must have been spectacular when it was fresh. She looked at it and then became aware that she was holding his face in her hand and that he had gone very still, and she stepped back. "Sit down," she said. "I'll heat water for a bath. You can tell me what you found after supper." He sat down without argument, which told her how tired he actually was. After supper, after the children were in bed, he put the papers on the kitchen table. They were copies, painstakingly written out in Clark's careful hand, copied from Voss's business ledgers. Pages and pages of them, columns of figures and names and dates. Effie bent over them in the lamplight, and Clark sat across from her and explained what he had found. It was worse than she had suspected, and exactly as bad as she had feared. Voss had been running a deliberate scheme for 3 years, targeting homesteaders with good water access, extending loans with terms designed to fail, collecting on those debts through legal means when possible and less legal means when necessary. The names of 6 other families were in those ledgers, families who had lost their properties to Voss's foreclosures. 3 of those foreclosures had been preceded by accidents or incidents involving the property owner. James Crawford's name was in there. The loan, the terms, the arrangement with a man listed only as RD for a settlement service on the Crestfield Road. $200 for a settlement service. Effie read those words and did not say anything for a long time. "RD," she said finally. "Roy Deaver," Clark said. "How do we get this to a federal marshal?" "There's a federal marshal's office in Wichita. It's far enough from Voss's network that Pritchard won't know about it until it's too late. The problem is making the journey." He paused. "The other problem is that this is copied evidence, not original. A good lawyer could argue it. Could the originals be taken?" He looked at her. "It would be considerably riskier than what I already did." "But could they?" He was quiet for a moment. "If I had a clear way into the building when it was empty, yes." "Voss takes his supper at the Long Branch Saloon every Wednesday evening without fail. He's there for 3 hours minimum. Pritchard has an office in the same building but leaves at 5. Deaver keeps irregular hours. So Wednesday evening between 5 and 8, Effie said. "That is the window, yes. When is the next Wednesday?" 4 days. She sat back in her chair and looked at the papers spread across her kitchen table, at the name RD and the sum of $200 and the careful notation of a settlement service that had left her children without a father, and felt the iron in her chest grow hotter. "You're not doing this alone," she said. He started to say something. "I know this county," she said. "I know the roads and I know the people, and I have as much reason as you do, considerably more reason to see this through. You're not doing this alone." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes that she had spent the last 5 days cataloging in her memory whether she intended to or not. "I know better than to argue with you," he said. "That is the correct conclusion," she said. She almost smiled. He almost smiled back. The 4 days between that conversation and the Wednesday evening were the most paradoxical she had experienced in recent memory, because the threat hanging over her was real, and the plan they were making was genuinely dangerous. And yet those 4 days were also somehow the most alive she had felt since James died. There was a specific, crackling energy in working alongside Clark, in planning and preparing and talking through every contingency, that she recognized dimly as the feeling of not being alone, a sensation she had forgotten enough that its return was startling. They worked through the details carefully. Effie would wait with the horses outside Dodge City while Clark went into Voss's building. She had contacts in Dodge City she had never used but James had mentioned. A woman named Pearl Cabot who ran the boarding house on Front Street and who, according to James, had her own reasons to dislike Voss. Pearl might be willing to confirm that Voss was at the saloon, so they would know the window was clear. On the Tuesday evening before the Wednesday, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Effie found Clark on the back porch, sitting on the step in the cold, looking out at the dark Kansas sky. She brought 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him, closer than was strictly necessary given that the back step was not particularly small. He took the cup she offered and wrapped both hands around it. They were quiet for a long time. The stars were extraordinary, the way they are on cold, clear nights in Kansas, a density of light that seems impossible until you live there long enough to take it for granted. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "Where did you come from?" Before the cattle driving before Dodge City. "Where are you from?" He was quiet for a moment. "Missouri, small town south of Kansas City. My father ran a mill." "Do you have family there?" "My father died when I was 19. My mother remarried and moved to St. Louis. I have a sister in Jefferson City." He paused. "I haven't seen her in 4 years." "Why not?" Another pause longer. "I made some choices after my father died that I'm not proud of. I worked for people I shouldn't have worked for. I told myself it was just survival, but that's what men tell themselves when they know what they're doing is wrong and they do it anyway." He looked down at his coffee. "I walked away from it eventually, but walking away doesn't clean the record." "What kind of work?" she asked, and her voice was careful and level because she wanted the truth and she did not want her tone to cause him to withhold it. "Freight protection," he said, which is a gentler name for what it actually was, which was collecting money from people who didn't want to pay it for men who had mechanisms for making them pay it. Silence. "You worked for men like Voss," she said. "Not for Voss specifically, but men of that type, yes, for about 2 years when I was 21. It's part of why I know how his operation works from the inside." He looked at her directly, meeting her eyes. "I need you to know that. Before tomorrow, whatever happens, I need you to know what I am." "What you were," she said. "The past doesn't disappear just because a person walks away from it." "No," she agreed. "But I'm less interested in what a person was than in what they choose to be when it costs them something. Anybody can be decent when it's easy." She looked at him steadily. "You rode 30 miles in a November night to bring supplies to a woman you'd never met because of a promise you made to her dead husband in your own heart. And you went into Dodge City and came back with a bruised face and evidence that could put a dangerous man in federal prison. That tells me what I need to know." He looked at her with an intensity that she felt in her chest, a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee cup in her hands. "Effie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed differently than she expected, softer and more specific. "Don't," she said, not because she didn't want him to continue, but because if he continued, she might do something that would make the morning significantly more complicated. "Tomorrow first, everything else after." He nodded slowly. "After," he agreed. They sat on the step for another hour, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and talked about other things, about his sister, about Thomas's aptitude for figures, about the spring and what the kitchen garden might look like if it was planted differently, about a dozen quiet ordinary things that felt enormous in the specific context of the cold night, and the stars and what tomorrow was going to require of both of them. She went inside eventually. She did not sleep any better than she had the previous 5 nights, but for different reasons. The Wednesday came with a clear sky and a dry cold. The kind of cold that smells like iron and makes sound carry farther than it should. They rode out before Thomas and Ruth were awake, having arranged with Agnes Whitfield the night before that the children could spend the day and night at the Whitfield place under the pretext of a family errand. They rode the 30 miles to Dodge City largely in silence, but it was not the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of two people who have said what needed to be said and are now saving their energy for what is coming. Pearl Cabot's boarding house on Front Street was a narrow 2-story frame building between a dry goods store and a barber shop, and Pearl herself was a compact woman of perhaps 50 with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that has learned never to register surprise. She recognized James Crawford's name immediately, and her expression shifted into something sorrowful and sharp. "I heard about James," she said. "I had my suspicions about the circumstances." "Your suspicions are correct," Effie told her. Pearl looked at her and then looked at Clark and then back at Effie. "What do you need?" "Confirmation when Voss leaves for the Long Branch at 5, and word if he comes back early." Pearl nodded once, as if this were a reasonable request. "I'll have my nephew watch from the window. He can get word to you at the livery if anything changes." They waited at the livery for 2 hours. The time passed in a specific kind of suspended tension, the tension of people who have committed to a course of action and must now wait for the moment of commitment to arrive. Clark checked his horse twice and his saddle bags once and otherwise sat still on a bale of hay and did not fidget, which Effie found oddly calming. She sat across from him and watched the door and thought about James, and about the 4 months since his death, and about what she was doing right now, riding into Dodge City to steal evidence from a man who had arranged her husband's murder, with a reformed muscle man turned quiet drifter who had shown up at her back door with supplies, and who made her feel things she was not supposed to be feeling yet. The frontier did not give a person time to be properly sequential about grief. That was one of its particular cruelties. At 20 minutes past 5, Pearl's nephew, a boy of about 15 named Daniel, came into the livery with word that Voss had just gone into the Long Branch with Pritchard, and that Deaver had ridden out of town to the north about an hour prior. Clark stood up. He looked at Effie. 3 hours, he said. 2 to be safe. "Be safe," she said, and then caught herself and looked away. She heard him make a small sound, somewhere between an exhale and a laugh, and then he was gone. She waited. She had positioned herself where she could see the front of Voss's building, a 2-story brick structure on the south end of Front Street that also housed Pritchard's law office. She sat in the livery doorway with her rifle across her knees and Daniel nearby, and she watched the building and the clock above the bank across the street and forced herself to breathe slowly and evenly. An hour and 20 minutes later, Clark reappeared at her side so quietly that she almost shot him. "Don't do that," she said sharply. "Sorry." He had a leather satchel tucked under his coat. His face was very calm, but there was a brightness in his eyes that spoke of adrenaline successfully discharged. "I have them, original ledgers, 3 of them the ones most directly relevant. We're going." They were out of Dodge City within 15 minutes, riding hard to the northeast, and by the time Harlan Voss finished his supper at the Long Branch Saloon and returned to his building, they were 10 miles gone into the Kansas dark. They stopped to rest the horses about 15 miles out, by a creek that was half frozen, and Clark spread the ledgers out by lantern light and showed her what he had taken. She looked at James's name one more time in Voss's own hand, in the original ink, and felt the truth of it settle through her like something finally coming to rest. "The Federal Marshal's office in Wichita," she said. "When can we go?" "I'll go as soon as you're back at the homestead and settled," he said. 4 days' ride. I'll take the originals and my copies both." "I'm going with you." He started to say something. "Agnes Whitfield will take the children for a week. She offered as much when I told her there might be matters requiring my attention in the coming weeks." Effie looked at him. "This is my case to present. Voss murdered my husband. I have as much right to stand in front of the federal marshal as you do. More." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Yes, you do," she nodded. "Then we're both going to Wichita." They rode back to the homestead in the dark and arrived just before 2 in the morning and put up the horses and came into the kitchen. And Effie made coffee because it was the thing she did when she needed to organize her thoughts, and they sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and looked at each other across the space of the last several hours. "You were very calm today," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "I know. You were calm anyway." She looked at him. "That's the only thing that matters, isn't it? Not whether you're afraid, whether you do it anyway." "That's exactly it," he said softly. And there it was, the thing she had been stepping around for 3 weeks, the truth she had been managing and cataloging and keeping at a safe distance because the timing was wrong and the circumstances were impossible, and she was a widow of 4 months with 2 children and a threatened homestead and a very specific set of priorities. None of those things had changed. And yet, "Clark," she said. He looked at her. "I need you to know something," she said. "And I need you to take it seriously and not make it into something it can't be yet. But I think if I don't say it, I will regret it, and I have enough regrets already." He was very still. "I am grateful for you," she said. "And I am not good at gratitude, I've been told. I am better at self-sufficiency than I am at accepting help. But what you've done in the past 3 weeks, not just the supplies and the work and the evidence, but the way you've talked to my children, and the way you've been honest with me even when the honesty was not comfortable, and the way you sat on the back step with me last night and talked about ordinary things like there was a future to talk about." She stopped and steadied herself. "I find myself very unwilling to imagine the Crawford homestead without you in it." The silence after that had a different quality than all the previous silences. He reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers. His hand was large and warm, and she could feel the roughness of his working calluses against her skin, and she did not pull away. "I've been fighting for 3 weeks," he said quietly, against saying something similar to that. "I know," she said. "I could tell." "Is it too soon?" he asked, and his voice was genuine, the question real. "By conventional standards, very much yes," she said. "By the standards of women who are 4 months widowed and about to lose their land and are currently holding stolen evidence in their kitchen, I think conventional standards may need some adjustment." "Effie, I'm not saying anything needs to happen tomorrow," she said. "I'm just saying what is true, so that you know it, so that if something goes wrong in Wichita or before Wichita or anywhere in the sequence of events between now and some better future, you know it." He turned her hand over and held it properly, her palm against his palm, and looked at her with those dark eyes that she had apparently committed to memory somewhere around the 3rd day of his arrival without consciously deciding to do so. "Nothing is going wrong," he said. "We're going to Wichita. We're going to give those ledgers to the federal marshal. And then we're going to come back here, and you're going to figure out whether you want me to stay. And I'm going to be honest with you about everything between now and then, and everything after, so you always know exactly what you're deciding about." She squeezed his hand and let go and stood up and said, "We ride for Wichita in 2 days," and went to bed, and this time she slept. The ride to Wichita took 4.5 days, not 4, because a section of the Kishom Trail south of Newton was badly iced over and they had to go around. They rode through country that in better seasons would have been beautiful, rolling grassland gone to pale gold under the November sky, the occasional homestead sending up columns of wood smoke against the cold, the distances that Kansas achieves so effortlessly stretching in every direction to the low horizon. They talked constantly. 4 days on horseback through open country is a very efficient mechanism for learning a person, because there is nothing to do but talk and look at the country and be honest about yourself. And the country is so large that small talk feels inadequate by comparison. She learned that he had been in Texas for 2 years after leaving Missouri, working cattle drives, which was how he had ended up on the drive with James. She learned that he had taught himself to read from a Bible his father had owned, which was why he read with a slight tendency to pause at punctuation, as if weighing the importance of each mark. She learned that he had a complicated relationship with violence, that he had been capable of it, and had used it and had decided at a specific, identifiable moment to no longer use it as a tool, and that this decision had been difficult and had cost him work and sometimes safety, but that he had held to it. She told him about Ohio, about her parents' farm, about meeting James at 19 at a church social, and recognizing immediately that he was the kind of man worth following to Kansas. She told him about the first years on the homestead, the difficulty and the beauty of it, the specific pride of building something in hard country. She told him about Thomas's birth and Ruth's birth, and the way James had been with the children, tender and patient and fiercely present. He talked about them the same way you just did, Clark said, the exact same way, the pride in his voice. I know, she said. That's one of the things I'm most grateful for, that he loved them so well for as long as he had. They were quiet for a moment. You don't have to put him away to make room for something new, Clark said carefully. I want you to know that. A person can carry love for someone who's gone and still have room. She looked at him riding beside her, his horse stepping carefully on the frozen ground, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. You say things sometimes, she said, that sound like they were thought about very carefully beforehand. Sometimes they were, he admitted. Some things are important enough to get right. Wichita in late November was colder than Dodge City and considerably larger. A cattle town still living on the memory of its years, as the head of the Kishom Trail, before Dodge City had taken over that business. The federal marshal's office was on Douglas Avenue, a solid brick building that projected bureaucratic competence, and the marshal himself, a man named Isaac Garner, was a heavy-set, deliberate man with a white-streaked beard and the eyes of someone who has heard a great many stories and developed reliable instincts about which ones to believe. He believed Effie. It took about 2 minutes of her speaking for Marshal Garner to start leaning forward in his chair, and by the time she had laid out the timeline of James's death, Voss's loan operation, and the evidence from the ledgers, he was fully alert in the way of a man who has been hunting a particular kind of prey for a long time and has just been handed a trail. I know Voss's name, he said, looking at the ledgers. He's been peripheral to 3 investigations in this district over the past 2 years. We never had anything direct. He looked at Effie. These are his original ledgers. They are. And the notation here, the settlement service payment to R.D. Roy Deaver, Clark said. He's known in Dodge City. I can identify him and testify to what I heard. Garner looked at Clark with a steady, assessing look. Clark met it without expression. And what's your involvement in this, Mr. Brenner? I knew James Crawford, Clark said. I've been helping his widow keep her homestead since I learned what happened to him. You've been helping her, Garner said, in a tone that suggested he found this answer adequate but not complete. Yes, Clark said, with a tone that suggested that was all the answer he intended to provide. Garner looked back at Effie. Mrs. Crawford, I'm going to need you to make a formal statement, and I'm going to need Mr. Brenner to do the same. I want to examine these ledgers thoroughly, and I'll need some time, likely 2 to 3 weeks, to build a federal case before we move on Voss. His lawyer has filed for seizure of my property as of January 1st, Effie said. If the case isn't filed before then, I'll have an injunction in place within the week, Garner said. That I can do quickly. No one is taking your land while this investigation is active. She let out a breath that she had been holding for what felt like 4 months. They spent 2 days in Wichita giving their formal statements, and Marshal Garner's deputy, a young man named Cord who was meticulous and fast with a pen, took down every word. They stayed at a boarding house on 2nd Street that was respectable and inexpensive, and ate their meals at a cafe down the block, and in the evenings sat in the boarding house's small common room by the fire and talked. On the second evening, Clark reached across the table and put his hand over hers again, and this time she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his and kept them there for the rest of the evening. On the morning of the 3rd day, when they were saddling up to ride back to the homestead, Clark held her stirrup for her while she mounted, and when she was up, he kept his hand on the stirrup iron and looked up at her. Effie, he said, "Yes," she said. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, with the particular care that she had come to recognize as his way of approaching things that mattered, "about what you said, about the homestead, about whether you wanted me to stay." And she said, "I want to stay," he said, "if you'll have me, not as a hired hand, not as a temporary arrangement, as someone who is there, present and permanent in whatever you need me to be, as long as what you need me to be includes staying." She looked down at him in the pale morning light of the Wichita stable yard, this quiet, complicated, careful man with his dark eyes and his scarred hands and his deep, particular honesty, and felt something in her chest that had been broken and mending for 4 months complete itself. "Come home," she said. They rode back to the Crawford homestead in 3.5 days, faster than the journey south because the ice had cleared on the main trail, and arrived on a gray December afternoon to find Thomas and Ruth restored by Agnes Whitfield and the kitchen cold, and the horses restless and approximately 17 things that needed immediate attention. Clark tended to the horses. Effie built up the fire. Thomas helped carry wood. Ruth told them, at great length and with significant editorial additions, everything that had happened at the Whitfield place in their absence. It was, Effie thought, putting the kettle on while listening to Ruth's account of a goat that had gotten into Agnes Whitfield's kitchen and eaten a loaf of bread, entirely ordinary. And the ordinariness of it, the specific, domestic, real texture of a working homestead in December, with a fire getting warm and children talking, and boots being knocked clean on the back step, felt like the most valuable thing she had encountered in a very long time. Clark came in from the barn, and Ruth redirected her narrative at him without pausing, and he listened to the goat story with the same seriousness he gave to everything, asking a follow-up question about whether the goat had suffered any ill effects from the bread that sent Ruth into extended speculation that occupied the entire time it took to make supper. That night, after the children were in bed, Effie and Clark sat at the kitchen table one more time, and this time there was no immediate crisis and no evidence to review and no plans requiring urgent formation. There was just the lamp and the fire and the sound of the wind and the particular piece of people who have come through something difficult and arrived somewhere better. "Thomas asked me this morning," Clark said, "if I was going to stay." Effie looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was up to his mother. He said, and I quote, that his mother had made up her mind about things 2 weeks ago and just hadn't said it yet." Effie felt the smile come before she could manage it. "He's a perceptive child." "He is extremely perceptive," Clark agreed. "He also told me that his father would have approved, which I think he said to reassure me, and which did, in fact, reassure me more than I expected." "James would have approved," Effie said, and meant it entirely. "He was a good judge of character. It's why he talked about you." "It's strange," Clark said, "being recommended by someone who isn't here to see the result." "Maybe he knew," Effie said, not quite seriously, not quite not seriously either. The investigation moved quickly after that. Marshal Garner was as good as his word. The injunction protecting the Crawford homestead from foreclosure was in place by December 15th. The federal case against Harlan Voss was filed on December 22nd, and Voss was arrested in Dodge City on the morning of December 23rd with a thoroughness that Garner's office had clearly been saving up. The Dodge City papers covered it. Word got back to Crestfield within a week. Effie heard the news from the postmaster when she went in for mail on the 24th, and came home and told Clark, who was on the roof replacing the shingles that had been bad since before James died, and he stopped and looked down at her from the roof with the winter sky behind him, and said nothing for a moment. Then he climbed down and stood in front of her and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her, and she looked back at him. And what passed between them in that moment required no words of any kind. He kissed her for the first time standing in the yard of the Crawford homestead on the 24th of December, 1882, with the smell of pine pitch and wood smoke in the air and the first light snowflakes of the winter coming down around them. She kissed him back with 4 months of grief, and 3 weeks of very carefully managed feelings and considerable conviction. Roy Deaver was arrested in January. Pritchard cooperated with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges and provided additional evidence. Harlan Voss was indicted on 17 counts including fraud, conspiracy, and 2 charges of criminal homicide, one for James Crawford and one for a homesteader named William Hart who had died in what had been ruled an accident 18 months earlier. Voss's trial began in March in Wichita Federal Court. Effie and Clark both testified. She sat in the witness chair and answered questions in her clear, direct way and named James, and named the date of his death, and explained the sequence of the debt and the arrangement and the ledger notation, and looked at Harlan Voss across the courtroom while she did it. He was smaller than she had imagined. Men who cause enormous harm often are. Voss was convicted on 14 counts and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Deaver received a life sentence. Pritchard, for his cooperation, received 8 years. Effie sat in the courtroom and heard the verdicts read and held very still. Clark was beside her. His hand found hers under the railing of the gallery and held it, and she did not pull away. Outside the courthouse, in the March sunshine of Wichita, she stood on the steps and breathed the cold air and felt something shift inside her that had needed shifting since September, a slow, deep settling, like a foundation finally finding level ground. "All right," Clark said beside her. "Yes," she said, and then honestly, not entirely, but more than I was this morning. "That's how it goes," he said. "One day at a time," she agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him slightly, and they stood on the courthouse steps in the March sunshine. And it was not a simple thing and it was not an ending, but it was a beginning which is sometimes more valuable. They were married in June. Effie had not expected to want a church wedding. She had expected something practical, a trip to the justice of the peace in Crestfield, a legal formality, efficient and complete. But Thomas had asked, with that particular focused seriousness of a 9-year-old who has thought the matter through, whether they were going to have a proper wedding, and Ruth had added that she wanted to see her mother in a nice dress. And Agnes Whitfield had appeared seemingly from nowhere to mention that Reverend Hollies at the Crestfield Community Church did a beautiful service. And Effie had found herself surrounded by opinions on the subject, and had capitulated with considerably less resistance than she would have predicted. The dress was pale blue wool, which was practical for a June, Kansas wedding, and also happened to be exactly the right choice, as Agnes confirmed multiple times. Thomas stood beside Clark at the altar with the serious bearing of someone who has been asked to perform a significant duty. Ruth held a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself from the creek meadow that morning, arranged with more enthusiasm than skill, which made them somehow more beautiful. Reverend Hollies did, in fact, do a beautiful service. Clark looked at Effie during the exchange of vows with an expression so direct and clear that she felt slightly undone by it, in the best possible sense, the sense of something carefully held being released into something larger. When he said, "I do," he meant it with every quiet, particular, honest ounce of himself, and she knew it, and said her own vows back to him with the same complete intention. There was a small reception at the Whitfield place afterward, because Agnes had insisted, and the whole of Crestfield that Effie had any regard for appeared to have been invited. Along with several people she had never met but who turned out to be neighbors from farms further out who had been following the Voss case, and wanted to offer their congratulations on its outcome. Clark stood in the Whitfield yard in the June sunshine and accepted handshakes and congratulations with his usual quiet manner, and every so often caught Effie's eye across the yard with a look that said, very clearly, that he would like to be alone with her before the day was finished. She felt the same. The children stayed at the Whitfield place for 2 nights. She and Clark rode home to the homestead in the long June evening light, and she had never seen the land look quite the way it looked that evening, the grass green from the spring rains, the cottonwoods in full leaf, the house solid and repaired on its foundation, The whole of the 112 acres she had fought to keep settled under the June sky like something she had earned. Which it was. Clark put up the horses. She went into the kitchen and stood for a moment in the quiet of the house, feeling it empty around her in a way that was new and oddly exhilarating. He came in from the barn and found her standing in the kitchen and looked at her across the room, and they were both quiet for a moment. And then she crossed the kitchen to him, and he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a long time, not saying anything, because everything necessary had already been said. Summer on the Crawford homestead, which became the Clark Brenner homestead by the end of that summer when Clark filed the appropriate papers with the county, was the best summer Effie could remember in recent years. Not without difficulty. The frontier being what it is, difficulty was structural, but difficulty undertaken alongside someone who met it with the same steady, resourceful attention that he brought to everything. Clark expanded the cattle operation carefully, buying 4 good heifers in July and spending considerable time with Thomas, who at 9 was old enough to begin learning the work in earnest, teaching him the fundamentals of cattle management in a way that treated the boy's intelligence respectfully and built his confidence along with his knowledge. Ruth, who was 6, followed Clark around the homestead with the specific persistence of a child who has decided that a person is interesting and wants to extract as much information from them as possible. Clark bore this with considerable patience and reciprocal interest, asking Ruth questions about her observations of the animals and the plants with a seriousness that made her feel attended to, which she was. Effie watched this from whatever she happened to be doing and felt the specific, complicated warmth of watching someone love your children well. He loved her well, too. He was not a demonstrative man in public, which suited her, since she was not a demonstrative woman in public, but in private he was specific and attentive and honest in ways that she found continually more valuable as time went on. He told her when he thought she was wrong about something, and listened when she told him the same. He noticed things, the way she held her shoulders when she was worried, the way she went quiet before she said something that mattered, and responded to those things with a gentleness that she had not expected from him, and that moved her, every single time. By autumn he had sold enough of the expanded cattle operation to pay off a significant portion of the remaining debts from James's original loan, since Voss's federal conviction had rendered the debt terms illegal, and the amount had been renegotiated to the original $400 with no accumulated interest, and they were able to start putting money aside for the first time. "We could put a new floor in the kitchen," Effie said, one evening in October, looking at the boards that had been warping since the previous spring. "We could," Clark agreed, looking at the boards, "or we could add a room to the north side of the house." She looked at him. He looked at her. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that if we were planning for the future, a room might be more useful than a floor. The floor can wait." She understood what he was suggesting and felt the warmth move through her from her chest outward. "A room," she said. "It doesn't need to be large," he said. "To start with." "To start with," she agreed. He built the room that winter, working on it in the evenings after the other work was done, and by spring it was finished. And by the following spring there was a very good reason to be grateful for the foresight. Their son was born in April of 1884, a fact that Thomas received with the complicated reaction of an older brother, approximately equal parts proud, worried about the workload implications, and immediately proprietary, and Ruth received with pure delight and the immediate conviction that she would be in charge of naming him, a position she prosecuted with some force. Clark held his son for the first time on a quiet April morning with the spring sunlight coming through the bedroom window, and looked down at the small, furious, perfect face with an expression Effie had never quite seen on him before, a kind of astonished tenderness that he made no attempt to manage or contain. "James," Clark said, not as a suggestion, Just as an observation of what seemed in that moment to be obviously true, she had thought about it. She had wondered whether she would feel strange about it, using James's name for a child Clark had fathered, whether it would create a tangle between the past and the present that couldn't be navigated cleanly. She did not feel strange about it. "James Clark Brenner," she said. He looked up at her. She could see that it mattered to him in a way he was not going to put into words, but that she could see entirely clearly without them. "Yes," he said. Ruth took a moment to accept that she had been somewhat outmaneuvered on the naming question, but she was a flexible child, and within about 10 minutes had decided that James Clark Brenner was in fact an excellent name, and that she had probably been thinking of it herself. Thomas, it turned out, was a very competent older brother. He had James's aptitude for figures, which Clark discovered when he found the boy doing the account books one afternoon, not because he had been asked to, but because he was curious about the numbers, and began teaching him in earnest after that. The Brenner homestead grew. Clark fenced the north pasture properly and drilled a secondary well to supplement the spring. He built a proper dairy shed in the summer of 1885 and expanded the cattle operation again. And by the following year the operation was generating enough income that Effie could hire Agnes Whitfield's daughter, a capable girl named Bertha, to help with the domestic work 3 days a week, which gave Effie time to do something she had been thinking about for 2 years. She opened a correspondence school. It started simply, as a response to the fact that there were 6 children on outlying homesteads within a 15-mile radius of Crestfield who could not get to the town school regularly, and Effie had been educated well enough in Ohio to be capable of teaching them. She began by sending lesson packets and receiving the children's completed work back through the mail, with corrections and new material following. Within a year she had 12 students. By 1887 she had 23, including several adults, and was charging a small fee that she used to buy additional books and materials. Clark thought this was one of the finest things he had ever seen, and told her so in those exact words one evening when she was sorting correspondence at the kitchen table. She looked up at him with a slight smile. "You said that with extreme conviction for someone who has never heard of a correspondence school before." "I've seen you do it," he said, sitting down across from her. "That's sufficient." "Flattery," she said. "Honesty," he said, meeting her eyes with that direct, dark gaze that she had been the subject of for 5 years and had never entirely gotten used to in the best possible way. In the fall of 1887, Effie discovered she was expecting again. This time it was a girl, born in February of 1888, with dark eyes like Clark's and the particular determined expression that seemed, in the Brenner family, to be heritable on both sides. She was named Margaret, at Thomas's suggestion, after Clark's mother, a fact that made Clark look at his stepson for a long moment with an expression of startled gratitude that Thomas, who was now 15 and considerably more perceptive than he had been at 9, received with the equanimity of someone who already understood exactly what he had done. 5 years in, the Crawford Brenner homestead was not a struggling widow's property barely holding on. It was a working farm with a proper cattle operation, a correspondence school generating real income, a roof that had been replaced twice and now did not leak, children who were educated and fed and safe, and a household held together by 2 people who had found each other through terrible circumstances and had built something real and permanent out of the rubble of loss. This did not mean everything was easy. The drought of 1886 cost them 6 cattle and a difficult year financially. There were disagreements, some of them significant, about money and about the children's education, and once, memorably, about whether to sell the North 40 acres to a neighbor who had made a fair offer. An argument that lasted 3 days and was resolved by Effie deciding she had been wrong and telling Clark so, which he received with the careful lack of triumph of a man who understood that winning arguments in a marriage was not actually winning. There were nights when Effie lay awake and thought about James, and felt the complicated layering of past and present that time does not resolve so much as incorporate, the grief that does not disappear but changes its shape and its weight as the years go on. Clark knew about those nights. He did not try to fix them. He would put his arm around her and stay awake with her in the dark, and sometimes they would talk about James, about specific things they remembered, stories Clark had heard on the cattle drive, stories Effie had lived, and she found that talking about him helped, and that Clark's willingness to let James be present in their life rather than requiring him to be absent was one of the most profound gifts he had given her. By 1890, Thomas was 17 and working the cattle operation with Clark as a full partner, learning everything Clark knew with the focused intensity of a boy who intended to make something significant of it. He had James's steadiness and Effie's precision and Clark's patience, a formidable combination. He was also, his mother noted with some amusement, extremely popular at the Crestfield dances, which Clark noted with the combination of amusement and protective vigilance that characterized his approach to the romantic prospects of the children he had helped raise. Ruth, at 13, was already her mother's daughter in the sharpest possible ways, reading everything she could get her hands on, corresponding with one of Effie's former correspondence students who had gone to a women's college in Ohio, and asking questions about whether there were colleges in Kansas that admitted women, which there were beginning to be, a fact that Clark researched carefully and reported to both Effie and Ruth at supper one evening. Putting a pamphlet from the Kansas State Agricultural College on the table with the comment that they ought to start thinking about it. James, who was 6 and had his grandfather Crawford's name and his father Clark's eyes, and his mother Effie's absolute refusal to be intimidated by anything, was learning to read from his mother and had opinions about the cattle that Clark was beginning to take seriously. Margaret, at 2, was largely occupied with the work of being 2, which is to say she was extremely active, extremely opinionated, and extremely interested in the barn cat, a large orange animal named Senator who bore her attentions with resigned dignity. On an evening in the summer of 1890, Effie and Clark sat on the front porch of the homestead as the sun went down behind the western horizon, and the Kansas sky turned its specific, spectacular shades of orange and pink and violet that make the state tolerable even in its most difficult seasons. The cattle were settled in the pasture. The children's voices came from inside the house, Thomas reading to James, Ruth in the kitchen learning to make biscuits with Bertha's instruction, the particular sound of a household in the peaceful portion of its day. Clark had his arm along the back of the porch railing, and she was sitting close enough to lean her head against his shoulder, which she did. She said, he said. "Do you remember the night you came to the back door?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel the slight shift of him beside her the way a person shifts when they are moving through memory. "Of course. You said somebody needed to think ahead," she said. "I remember. I've thought about that a great deal," she said. "The idea of thinking ahead, what it means to plan for a future when you can't see what the future is going to look like." "You have the same capacity," he said. "You just didn't have anyone doing it with you." "No," she agreed. "I didn't." She lifted her head and looked at him in the evening light, this man who had arrived in her life through the dark and the cold with 2 crates of supplies and a dead man's name, and a particular kind of quiet that she had spent 8 years learning to read and had not yet exhausted. "I'm glad you came." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that she had fallen in love with over a kitchen table in the November of 1882, and put his hand against the side of her face in the way he sometimes did when words were less efficient than contact, and she leaned into his palm. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The Kansas sky deepened above them, the stars appearing one by one at the edges of the dark, the way they always did, the way they had on the night she had held a rifle at a stranger's chest and demanded he explain himself, and been given an answer that changed everything. 8 years of harvest and drought and cattle and children and sorrow and work and love. 8 years of building something together on 112 acres of Kansas land that someone had tried to take from her and that she had held, that they had held, with everything they had between them. She put her head back on his shoulder and listened to the sound of her children inside the house, and felt the particular piece of a life that has been fought for and won. The stars came out fully over the Brenner homestead, and the August night settled warm and close over the Kansas plain. And inside the house Thomas's voice was reading something aloud to James, and the words drifted out through the open window, clear and steady. A young man's voice doing what he had been taught to value, passing knowledge forward. Clark's arm came around her, and she closed her eyes. Outside, the land that someone had tried to steal spread away from the house in every direction. The pastures and the fields and the dry creek bed that ran with water every spring. The good underground spring that Harlan Voss had wanted and that Effie had kept, that they had kept. The drifter had thought ahead, and what he had been thinking ahead toward, it turned out, was this exact thing. Two people on a porch in the Kansas summer night, a household full of children and work and ordinary life, a future built carefully and deliberately on the site of something that had tried very hard to be a ruin. She breathed in the summer air and felt him breathe beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. After a while, she considered. "That I'm grateful," she said, "and that gratitude is easier now than it used to be." "That's growth," he said with the slight dryness that she loved in him. "Don't be smug about it," she said. "I wouldn't dare," he said. She laughed quietly against his shoulder and felt him smile, and the Kansas night went on around them, full of sound and star and the specific, profound ordinariness of a life that had found its shape. Inside the house, Margaret woke from her evening nap and made her opinion known loudly. Effie moved to get up, and Clark said, "I'll go," and pressed his lips to her temple before rising, and she watched him go inside, listened to the sound of his voice, low and easy, talking Margaret down from outrage to curiosity in the space of 2 minutes, which he had always been able to do, the same way he had always been able to talk most difficult things down from crisis to manageable. It was a gift. She had recognized it the first night, across the kitchen table in November lamplight, and she recognized it now, 8 years on, and she did not think she would ever stop recognizing it, the particular value of a person who brings steadiness to uncertain ground. She looked out at the dark fields and thought about what came next. Thomas would need to think about his own land in the coming years. Ruth was corresponding with the Women's College in Ohio with increasing specificity. James would grow into the operation, she thought. He had that in him. Margaret would be whatever she decided to be, fiercely and completely. And she and Clark would be here, or somewhere, growing older together, still arguing about the sensible things and agreeing about the important things, and finding, consistently, that the life they were building had more room in it than either of them had expected. The front door opened behind her, and Clark came back with Margaret on his hip, the little girl already subsiding from her earlier outrage into the drowsy content of a child who has been picked up by a familiar person and is no longer bothered. He sat back down beside Effie with Margaret between them, and Margaret reached out one small hand and grabbed a fistful of Effie's skirt and held on, which was her way, and Effie covered the small hand with hers and held on back. The three of them sat on the porch as the night deepened, and inside the house the other children's voices moved and settled, and the cattle lowed once, far away in the pasture, and the August stars turned slowly overhead. This was what thinking ahead looked like. Not a plan in a ledger, not a calculated arrangement, but a porch in the dark with your family around you, and the land solid under the house, and the future genuinely open and genuinely worth moving toward. Clark looked at her over Margaret's head, and she looked back at him, and they did not need to say anything at all. They had said everything necessary over 8 years of mornings and evenings and difficult days and good ones, and what remained between them needed no language because it was language, the specific and irreplaceable vocabulary of two people who had built something real together. He reached across Margaret and took Effie's hand. She held his, the way she had the first time, her palm against his palm, and felt the warmth of it move all the way through her. The Kansas night was full and clear above the Brenner homestead, and the stars were the same stars they had always been, indifferent and magnificent, and below them the land was theirs, kept and tended and full of life, and the future was a country they would ride into together. As they always had, as they always would.